It is so amazing to see all of you here this morning. Really excited to spend some time with you today and to share on you with this topic of moral injury. My name is Doug Lumpkin. I'm an AFSOC chaplain, and I'm presenting today along with Chaplain Philip Stewart, and he'll introduce himself here at our next session and tell you about his background, which is fascinating and interesting towards this topic. And we're just so excited to be here with you today and to be with the team from Canon HC who are putting this event on. And also, it's amazing, we've got another presenter, Chaplain Cornegie, who is across base right now presenting this to troops. So not only are you getting some education today in this fascinating study of moral injury, but we're also leveraging another resource to go out and help some of your folks learn what this is. So I'm hoping maybe one of them drops by your door at some point in time and goes, hey, they did this thing about moral injury. Can you talk to me a little bit more about that? And as soon as they say that, well, we'll have prepared you for the next few hours here today and a little bit tomorrow to give them some answers back and to see if you can help them walk through some things that might be they might be holding on to from particularly combat experiences. As I said, my name is Doug Lumpkin. I am a chaplain from AFSOC. I have had a distinct pleasure of working with Air Commandos for 10 years, which is super weird in the AFSOC world. Usually chaplains come in and go out, but some reason I keep backing into more and more assignments with Air Commandos. So I was down at Herbie for 2 tours back to back, and I'm currently serving at Fort Bragg. You may wonder, okay, what does this guy know about moral injury? So I'm going to give you just a little bit of background about who I am and where I've come from so that you can contextually frame some of the things that I'll be giving you today. So prior to my time at Herbie, I was an I was a hospital chaplain down in Pensacola, Florida. And one of the things that's unique about Pensacola is we had a huge veteran population. And I worked on the oncology ward. And what tended to happen is a bunch of folks who had never seriously spent a lot of time thinking about life and their own mortality stared at the ceiling of a hospital for weeks at a time. And all of a sudden, they wanted to unpack some things and to talk about some things. And a lot of those folks were Vietnam veterans. And here, 40 years after that war had ended, many of them were telling their stories for their very first time. But unfortunately, it was on their deathbed. And really, in a lot of ways, they didn't have much that they could do with the remainder of their life to process that story. And so after I got to Herbie and I was there a few years, I started to see some of these similar things happening to our folks who were coming back from deployments and people I interacted with there. And so I went and pursued a doctorate in traumatic injury. And at that time, I found this concept of moral injury. And I thought, that's what I got to write about. That's what I need to figure out how to implement and start thinking about. And I'll be really honest with you, back at the time, if you were to look for all the books of moral injury on Amazon or something, there were like 5 or 6 of them. And so it was pretty easy for me to become an expert really quick in everything that was out there. I don't think you could do that now. And I'm fascinated by that and I'm excited about that. However, I think it may lead us to some bad conclusions, and we'll get to that here in a minute. So I went and I did my research project, and then I got a couple opportunities to field test my research and my thoughts about all of this. I call them a field test. The Air Force usually calls them deployments, but I was able to go to Iraq and Afghanistan and Jordan and some other places and really get to see how this stuff works on the ground level. And I was surprised by how much of this I saw around me. In fact, I started reading some books, and I was finding moral injury everywhere. And so if you're familiar with the field at all, actually let's do that just as a baselining question. How many of you have heard about this concept of moral injury before you got this invite to the seminar? Thank you. I am so happy. Would you guess how many people would raise their hand 5 years ago when I would do something like this? Maybe one. So somebody feed back to me. Where did you hear about this at? Was it in a class, at a seminar? Where did you go? Where did you first hear about this? Yeah.
I was at this place with a guy named Doug Lumpkin.
Oh, that warms my heart.
It was such a good presentation, I followed up with it. So if I ever find that guy.
Yeah, if you find that guy, he's probably a good chaplain. I'd go anyway. Yes, ma'am.
Sir, I have not heard of it, but I
Yeah.
And at that point, there still wasn't anything at least about moral injury. So my guess is somewhere between 8 years ago and today, it became more something that the VA, because the VA is very much involved.
Right, it's bubbled up at the VA, which is fantastic,
But
right?
I didn't hear about it before this
Right.
presentation. So.
Yeah. Who else? Yes.
The moral injury symposium in DC.
Yeah. So SOCOM put on a moral injury symposium in DC, and that was pre-COVID. So we had lots of folks there, and we were all gathered together, and we were learning lots of things together. It was fantastic, and I was just shocked. And this guy right here, who was being so kind to me earlier, was also one of our presenters there. And so one of the caveats that I'm going to give today is that I'm not going to kid myself and think that I am an expert up here that will be revealing a lot of facts to you today. My caveat is I understand all of you to be experts in the field that you are here with. And as we begin to discuss moral injury today, I think you're going to go, oh yeah, I see that all the time. Oh yeah, I know exactly what he's talking about. This stuff's going to come up over and over again. And what's so cool about this thing of moral injury is for most people, it resonates. And then you go from here, and it just gives you a new framework to identify people who may be suffering and figure out how you can help them on the road to healing. So you spoke of the VA earlier, and I'm so grateful about that. So one of the things I think we get into this idea set is that this moral injury concept is brand new. But the guy who did this originally, so in the 90s, Jonathan Shea was the one who coined the term moral injury and started to think about this seriously. And his book was Achilles in Vietnam. And he connects it back to he has another book, Odysseus in America. He connects it back to these ancient Greek stories and says there's moral injury all the way back through here. And so even though this is a new field where we've started to put some language around it, it is actually a very ancient thing that happens. It's something that occurs all throughout different time spans and different peoples. I was reading a new book that's been released here recently, and there's a concept that, okay, so maybe this is an Americanized thing or a Christianized thing of some way or another. And there is a biblical scholar who writes about the Old Testament story of Saul. Dude's name is Brad Kelly. And he's of Saul. And he talks about how the first king of Israel was kind of a reluctant leader in the first place. And then as time went by, he's got this other guy who seems to be currying more favor than him, even though he's doing the very best he can for the kingdom. And then all of these things start to happen and his world unfolds. And he said, we should probably read this through a lens of moral injury. And ultimately, if you remember the story, Saul ends up taking his own life. It falls on his own sword. And he said, like, if we use this framing to re-examine some of these biblical stories, we'll find a lot of moral injury if you come from that side of the house. And of course, when we're talking about moralities, when we're talking about soul wounds, all of this stuff has religious context. But it's not just a Christianized thing. In fact, if we go to the Bhagavad Gita, which are the Hindu scriptures, I love one of the things written in here. In fact, the very beginning of the book opens with this, and I want to make sure I get it right here. So Arjuna is the guy who's fighting what he believes to be a just cause. And what happens is, one day he goes out and he surveys the battlefield. He's essentially riding the chariot through the middle of the battlefield. And he looks on both the left and the right side, and he begins to realize that he is seeing brothers and cousins and teachers and people that have influenced his life on both sides of the battlefield. And it disturbs him greatly because even though he thinks he's fighting on the right side, he's now confused about why these other people he trusted are over here. And so there's this text in there that says, he says, evil will haunt us if we kill them. And a few verses later, Arjuna is slumped down in his chariot, he's put down in his bow and arrow, and his mind is tormented by grief. And he gives this incredibly beautiful statement about moral injury. He says, my conflicting sacred duties confound my reasoning. And I'm like, whoa, yes, that is what moral injury is. My conflicting sacred duties confound my reasoning. Also picked up this book a few years ago, Exploring Moral Injury in Sacred Texts. Throughout all religious literature, throughout all time frames of war, we see people struggling with and dealing with moral injury. There's also some additional concepts that maybe this is a post-Vietnam thing with Jonathan Shea. Maybe this is a post-9/11 thing. But what you find over and over again, in addition to the ancient texts, I was reading this book called The Deserters, talking about World War II folks who left their post at some point in time. And as you read through this book, there's moral injury all over the pages. You've got people who performed incredibly bravely under some amazing circumstances where their lives were in danger. But what seems to be the triggering point for many of them was not the fear and the danger part. It was something that happened in a moral sphere where they were conflicted. And at the end of the book, one of the folks reflects on his dad's time, and he says, my dad never fully came home. He left part of himself in Europe, and we never got to see that. And that is that idea that somehow the soul is still attached in a weird way to a place where conflict existed. So we got some army ground guys here, right? Catch-22. If you ever reread this after you learn a little something about moral injury, you'd be like, oh my goodness. So Army Air Corps guy, right, closer to our founding here in the Air Force, he talks about all kinds of different betrayal by leaders, what is right, what is wrong, what seems to be right before you get there, and what seems to be perfectly normalized in terms of morals once you've arrived in a battlefield. And so I would encourage you to recheck that back out through a lens of moral injury. Generation Kill, I don't know if you've seen this, but this is Marines in Iraq. You can read through this book and find moral injury everywhere. One of the earlier passages in here talks about a guy named Trombley, and some of the other Marines were giving him a hard time because he killed a camel. He was shooting at some people and he killed a camel, and it touches a nerve. And the reason he gives for why it touches a nerve is because the camel is innocent. And I can't tell you now. Okay, so it's like 2 sentences in this book. But I can't tell you the number of times that I have talked to people in the AFSOC world where they have felt perfectly fine about dropping ordnance on the bad guy. And they've got no issue with that. But there's some collateral damage. A horse that's tied up while the field is on fire that can't get away. A dog that is exploded along with, and they get the sense that animal is innocent. And while I'm okay with that guy because he's a terrorist and that's how we've identified him, that component of this innocent being wrapped up in the issues of war seems to really have a hold in people's lives, and it's something that they have to process and work through. Moral injury. And then this is a more, I think literally just in the last couple months, this book has come out, Alpha. It is about the Navy SEALs. So some of the folks that we work with in the Greater Joint Force, and I don't care which side of the story you come down on these things, whose version of events you believe, there is moral injury covering almost every page of this book, where people have felt betrayed by their teammates, by people who they once trusted, folks who feel like they're trying to do the right things, but either the people in their command don't understand, or the people in the civilian side of the house don't understand, and they are incredibly conflicted. And I will just guarantee you that while the book has not been written yet about our quiet professionals, this stuff exists in our world too on a regular basis. And I'm so glad that you're here with us today to talk through these items. All right, let me actually give a slide. It's a beautiful intro slide. So at this point, one of the things that we see, and I believe this to be true, I think once you start to put some framework around this stuff, you're going to find that moral injury is ubiquitous. And so it's rather weird for me to come up here and attempt to speak to you as some sort of moral injury expert, because I don't think that kind of concept exists. We all live day in and day out making choices about what's right and what's wrong, and expending our own capital and our own piece of our humanity on trying to make the best decision that we can. And then having other people judge whether or not we're innocent or culpable or have made the right decision or have made the wrong decision. And so to be an expert in moral injury is kind of like to be an expert in having a pulse. It lives so much around us that I deputize you now all as experts in moral injury, because you see this every day in your life. And in fact, as we move into treatment models and some of those things that we think about there, in reality, the person who has the moral injury is the expert on that moral injury. They know what they are dealing with. They understand what they are processing. They understand what they are working through. All we are there to do is to be conduits and tools to help guide them in healthy directions. I had a mentor once who said that if you do not handle things in a healthy way, you will handle things in an unhealthy way. And that's just necessarily true. You will choose one of those things or the others. And so our job really is just to be conduits to help them walk through these things. I have a BYU researcher that I work with, MC Ingerson, and one of his fascinating phrases he says is that there are no wrong doors when it comes to moral injury. We just want people to walk in my door, your door, physical, psych, spiritual, whatever, social, whatever domain that you're in. We just want them to walk in the door and to start processing these things, and for us to point them in a healthy direction, or to realize what we're seeing, and if we can't point them in the right direction, to interface with a different SME who has some additional skills and ability to help continue them along that path for what they identify as the way in which they need to move towards their healing. So thank you all for being here. It is so incredibly important for us to work these things together. So if we're all experts on moral injury already, my job here today really is to give you some language and some framework to help you understand it a little bit better and identify it a little bit better when we see it. And so Brett Litz, who's a researcher in the field here, when he is asked to give a definition of moral injury, this is where he goes to. He says, is the physical, emotional, and spiritual responses to an event or a set of events that transgress deeply held moral beliefs. And that word transgress is important. We're going to come back to that in a minute. And then there's another guy, Wilson, who says, he opens up the aperture just a bit bigger on this, because we see it in so many different places, that literally he just boils it down to what has happened is that people have been forced, or have by their own choosing, are now just participating in tragic circumstances. And when we participate in tragic circumstances, we have to figure out how to process that stuff. Okay, so back to that word transgress. If you'll join me in the etymology corner, we're going to be etymology nerds for just a minute. So if you remember your Latin, which I'm sure we all do, gress is from the root grad, and that gress means to step. Okay, so if someone is to regress, what are they doing? They're taking a step backward, right? If someone is to egress, what are they doing? Stepping out. Right? There's a fire. I'm stepping out of this place. What does transgress mean? What's that trans word modifying there? Over. You did good in theology, right? Somewhere in there, right? Okay. So okay, it's our chaplain who answers. That's of course right, because transgress, man, that's a word in our tradition, right? We understand what it means in terms of sin and humanity when someone has transgressed, and we understand that there's a process for getting them right again after they've done that. But here, what I want you to think about in this word transgress is basically someone has drawn a line in the sand. They have said, across this place, I will not step, because this is moral and that is immoral, and I will not be like those people over there. And then one day, because of circumstances, because of a situation, because of a decision they made too quickly or without thinking, or just because life sucks sometimes, and everything's not as black and white as we would like it to be, they found themselves on the other side of the line. And now they have to look back to the person that used to judge them for being over here and reconcile themselves with that. That is moral injury, my friends, when we have transgressed our own set of boundaries and beliefs about what is right and what is wrong in the world, and now we've got to figure out how to make that work again. So I think of this in a format of dissonance, right? So when we're growing up in life, early in life, we have this idealized picture of the world. Everything's bright and sunny, and now there are some people who have had tragedy since the day they've been born. But for many of us, our normalization is that things were pretty good. You know, we had a happy childhood. We went to school, and all of you are professionals and experts in your field, so you probably did really well in school. You know, you developed friends throughout life. You have careers now that are on a good path and that are successful. Maybe you're part of a religious community that was thriving and wonderful, and golly gee whiz, everything's just really swell, right? And then, at some point in life, a tragedy occurs. At some point in life, your understanding of the black and white world that you lived in suddenly turns a million shades of gray. And something happens that you weren't expecting. I will tell you, for our operators, sometimes it's the very first time that they have failed at anything in their life comes as part of their experience here with us. And sometimes part of that experience happens on a battlefield somewhere else, raising the stakes incredibly. And so what has happened now is that there is this dissonance that exists between the way things should be and the way things are. Perhaps it's a religious community that something happened inside of and they no longer feel welcome there. Perhaps it's a PCS where everything seemed like it was really, really good, but now they're working for leadership who they don't appreciate. Or a million other things that have now changed that distance between the way things are and the way things should be. And that delta that exists between the two of those things, if it remains high, if we can't begin to wrap our heads around the differences between the way things are and the way that things should be, that is depression. That is a line of living in depression. And if we don't begin to close that gap, we will make all kinds of terrible choices to make us feel like life is okay again. And usually things that get our adrenaline pumping, or making just decisions that will self-medicate. We'll maybe just ride that motorcycle way too fast down the back road out here. Just doing all kinds of things just to somehow feel alive again, because life has lost its meaning as we try to unpack ourselves from the cloudiness of where we find ourselves. And so, again, if we don't choose to handle things in a good way, we will handle them in a bad way. And so part of what we're trying to do is just close that distance for people. Now, one of the examples I give of this, right, so usually I speak to chaplains, so I hope y'all will forgive me for some of the religious content that's associated, but I think this is probably true for most everyone who was raised in an American context. We have this very idealized understanding of the world that says, "Thou shalt not kill," right? That is ingrained in our human understanding and is taught to us over and over in very different ways, that violence is never the answer. Thou shalt not kill, right? And then what happens the first time you as an airman are out on a battlefield somewhere and you're under attack and you have to arm up and you have to take the life of someone else? All of a sudden, you find yourself on the other side of this line that maybe you had kind of conceptually thought about, but hadn't actually thought about what it was like to be on the other side of that line. And we'll get into some of that some more here in a minute too. But so this dissonance between the way things are and the way things should be. The way things are is that the world is a fairly good place and there are fairly good people. And then I deploy somewhere and I see atrocities, or I see some fairly bad things. And now I've got this dissonance and I don't know where to place myself anymore. And I have to renegotiate how I understand my view of the world. And if I can renegotiate and bring those things back together, I'm probably fine. But if I leave those things very distant from each other, trouble will ensue. Okay, so as we're thinking about who is impacted by moral injury, what we see is the original work that was done here, Jonathan Shea, as he talked about, he said that it was someone who witnessed a tragic or traumatic event. Specifically for him, he was thinking in terms of leadership has made a choice of some sort. He's very much leadership-based in terms of betrayal is very important in his model. When he was working with, these were Vietnam veterans that he was working with, and he'd get them together in rap groups is what he called them, that's such a cool word from like the 80s and 90s. So he'd get these rap groups together. And these were folks who had undergone PTSD treatment. He was a VA psychologist. And what he was finding is these guys were still stuck. they were not making progress as was to be expected. And so as he started to pull the thread on all these stories, he kept finding places where these folks had been betrayed by their leaders. And so they had witnessed this thing that was crossed that line. A leader crossed the line between right and wrong. And this person had witnessed it and been a part of it. So then we move into some of the further study. Brett Litz and some other folks who've looked at this over the years goes, hey, not only is it that you might have seen something, but you might have done it. Like because of circumstances or because of whatever was happening at the time, you might have actually committed the thing and put yourself on the other side of this transgressed line rather than just because where you were, you wake up one day and find yourself on the other side of the transgressed line. And then as we continued to process through this a little bit, they were finding some of the similar type of stuff around like 911 dispatchers and some other folks who weren't even at the scene at all. And so it's someone who has heard about a tragic or traumatic event. And that one's interesting for us, I think, as we move towards a framework of modern warfare, where our things tend to happen now more through screens than they do face-to-face contact. And so I remember, and this was about a decade ago, a wonderful MFLAC that I used to work with, who I have a great relationship with. She was confused. We had an airman who was in the intelligence squadron, and this person one day she said, I just can't do this anymore. I can't watch another video. I just can't do it. And so the question came down, so, you know, what kind of video are we talking about? Are we talking about like those grainy images that come back from the sensors? And at the time, yeah, that's what we were talking about. It was some really grainy images that were coming back from sensors. And so the MFLAC was like, I don't understand. She said, Doug, these folks will go and they'll watch a movie this weekend, some horror flick that's in full HD on the big screen this weekend, and that doesn't bother them, but this does. How does that work? And she didn't mean any malice by it. She just could not wrap her head around these different ways of understanding. And so what I was able to just express to her and talk to her about is that the soul knows that one of those is not real and the other one is. The soul knows, and it holds that, and it carries that, and it knows that the things that she's doing, that airman was doing on this end, had an impact that far outweighed what she was seeing there on the screen. And so these are the different places that we see moral injury occur. In fact, it's as more of the research is being done, it's really any perceived moral transgression, and that perceived word is important. As I told you earlier, that you are the expert on your own moral injury. If it's yours, like you know all the details about it. And so a lot of times I'll have someone tell me their moral injury. They won't know that that's what they're doing, but they'll tell me their moral injury, and I'll think, dude, I'm not sure what you're broken up about here. But because in their spirit, in their soul, they perceive it to be a moral transgression, I have to work with them to help them close that gap. A lot of times you'll find circumstances like that was completely outside of your control. You made the only logical decision humanly possible, but it doesn't matter because it's a perceived moral transgression. And so we're seeing a lot of research come out now in the medical profession, especially in a I'd like to say post-COVID, post the beginning of COVID world, where we're seeing a lot of folks feeling some moral pain associated with behavior that they're experiencing and encountering. We're seeing first responders for a long time, for the chaplain folks in the room, CISM was something that we've been doing for years and years, trying to do that critical incident stress management. We might have got out a little over our skis on that one a little bit. Sometimes, and my generalized caution here and why we want to return control back to the client, as is their story and they are the expert on moral injury, is sometimes in our attempt to be helpful, we have managed to pull things out of people that have been re-traumatizing, and we have done damage instead of good. And so I want us to learn from those folks who were trying to do something good for firefighters and police officers and others. And my best example of this is that in this role, our tendency is to want to be newspaper reporters. We're trying to draw facts out of people. And that's really not the way to handle this. The way to handle this is that we are walking alongside them and sharing their burdens with them. And so we are taking from them whatever they will give us. It is not our requirement. Now, we want to ask some framework questions that may help them move towards a better place, but we are not trying to make the story make sense in our minds. That's not what's important. It's perceived moral transgressions. It needs to make sense from the place that they are coming from, and we can work through those details from there. Sexual assault obviously has huge moral connotations, and so we see it in victims of sexual assault. Infidelity, moral connotations there as well, and so moral injury gets identified in a lot of those places. And as I get older and now have kids and grandkids, the parenting issues that I address with folks that are in our formations that tend to be older in the commander and the chief spots and some of those types of things, maybe their kids didn't turn out the way that they raised them. Boy, there's some moral connotations in that stuff. It's amazing where we find, as I said, we swim in moral decision making all the time. And when we feel like those things are incongruent between the way that we want things to be and the way things are, we struggle and we suffer. All right, so up to this point you may be going, okay, Doug, I've heard what you said, but boy, a lot of that sure sounds like stuff that maybe we'd see in terms of PTSD. And what you will find in the literature over and over again is that PTSD and moral injury symptoms tend to overlap on a really consistent and regular basis. So I don't know about you, but in these challenging times which we find ourselves, there's another field of study where symptoms tend to overlap. So at home, it seems like on a regular basis now we have the Venn diagram pulled up of COVID symptoms and seasonal allergies. And it's like, okay, the kids are sneezing, they're fine, right? Or there's no fever, right? Okay, so like we see this happen all the time in symptomology where things overlap and it takes us some understanding of what exactly is going on. And I think that's what Jonathan Shea actually was struggling with. He's looking at these guys that going, okay, we've done this PTSD treatment. This is supposed to work, but they're still stuck. And so if we can identify and tease out some of the differences between what is moral injury and what is PTSD, it will help us get these folks the help that they need. All right, so this is the model in which I think of this. For PTSD, we understand that there is some sort of fear component associated with that. Something has happened where now our system is on high alert at all times, and we start reacting in ways where it's like, okay, I'm jumping now. I'm sitting with my back to the door. I'm trying to identify everything that goes on. And literally, I'll tell you what, I will come back from a deployment somewhere, and we will go to the food court at Fort Bragg, which is perfectly safe, I think. And my wife is like, what are you doing? I'm just on high alert because I've been doing it for 3 or 4 months, you know? I'm just on high alert because I'm ready at any moment for something to happen. So that fear component is part of the driving thing that we see in terms of the medical and the PTSD diagnosis. And we've got to get those folks good because I tell you what, if they're in that world and they have moral injuries sitting over the top of it, there's a good chance I can't deal with this as long as we're still dealing with this. And so for those of you from the mental health side of the house, thank you. Thank you for helping us get these folks to where their anxiety can be tamped down enough that we can have a serious conversation. But this other thing exists as well in the spiritual framework, and we see this in terms of guilt and shame. There was a study that said that most of the people who go to the VA seeking treatment actually go there for symptoms of guilt and shame. And this is not, it's not that same fear-based treatment. And if we only do that treatment with someone who has those symptoms of guilt and shame, there's a chance we may not actually see any improvement because we haven't addressed the underlying need of what is actually going on there. There's a VA chaplain up in Durham that I went to visit a few years back with some of my other chaplain colleagues. And we were sitting around, and this is probably 4 years ago maybe, and trying to think about moral injury and how we handle it in our context. And the VA had gotten a hold of it, and they were doing some good things. And so one of my chaplain colleagues asked the VA chaplain, he said, like, what do you use to determine whether or not somebody has moral injury? And the VA chaplain was kind of like, I don't understand what you're asking. The guy was like, do you use a survey, a metric tool? Like, how are you trying to classify people as morally injured? And the chaplain was like, no, man, I just assume that if they come in the door, they're morally injured. And I was like, okay. So if they come in the door of the chaplain's office, they're morally injured. I was like, no, man, I assume if they come into the door of the VA that they're morally injured. And then he said this thing, which was kind of the kicker. He said, haven't been wrong yet. And so because these moral decisions exist all around us, we live in this stuff on a regular basis, and it forces us to deal with these things on a regular basis. There is some research that does connect morally injurious events to PTSD, right?
I'm going to address
This is-
it directly in the next presentation.
He's got you. Yeah. Listen, I am infinitely practical. He's infinitely smart. So, but yes. So I'll tell you, I had a security forces tech sergeant. I was sitting in late at night, and he was the sergeant on duty, and everybody else had gone off on patrol. It's just me and him sitting around, and he basically has done everything he needs to do for the night, other than stand around and make sure there's no emergencies to go rescue anybody. And so we're sitting in their conference room down at Herbie, and he just begins to unpack some of his deployment experiences for me. And we just talk about it. And I just ask him some really gentle questions. And literally, y'all, I did nothing. I really didn't do anything other than just be a warm body, asking a smart question or two, perhaps. And at the end of that, he was like, I've been in therapy for 4 years. And we did more in the last hour. He thought it was only an hour. It was like 2.5 hours. But he's like, we did more in the last hour than I've been able to accomplish up to this point. And so I really do think that if we leave people broken, right, this POTFF idea that we have is a holistic domain.
Yes.
And if we leave people broken in any format, I gotta think, if you've got physical pain and we don't get that fixed, which, by the way, most of our people aren't going to admit to, right? Because, I got to make it to 18 or 19, and then all of a sudden the list comes out, right? If we don't get that physical pain fixed, I think we'll probably cycle back. If we don't get the spiritual pain fixed, I think we'll cycle back. If we don't get the PTSD, that fear-based stuff, tamped down and actually worked through, I think people will cycle back. I think that's just how humans are. We're a ball of mess. And while it's great that we have 4 domains or 5 domains or wherever we're at right now, humans don't work that way. We're inclusive and we're all-encompassing. You're going to address some more probably in that. So we've got a whole deep dive here that I think we'll address. But did that answer?
Yes, absolutely.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's see. So speaking of my tech forces security guy, security forces guy, here's your BOLO. Here's the things to be on the lookout for. All right, so excessive shame, unresolved guilt, a loss of faith, extreme sorrow, intensely negative thoughts, broken belief systems, right? I used to be, but now I'm not. Shattered innocence, I saw something, and now I don't know if I believe the same things about the world anymore. This is Jonathan Shea right here, right? Betrayal by leadership and by friends as well. Uncertainty between right and wrong, this blurring that tends to happen, which, by the way, is very normalized in our communities, where sometimes getting to yes is more important than right and wrong, and so we've got to be on guard for that. Feeling that sacrifices go unnoticed, loss of hope, and this one's interesting, right? So I have deep sorrow for the stories that Vietnam vets have told me about their post-deployment experience. And just some of the things that they suffered and the way that war was framed was just, feeling that sacrifices go unnoticed. However, the pendulum has swung in a weird way. And the thank you for your service, hero complex kind of thing that now exists actually traps us somehow in another morass of difficulty. Because in reality, while I am super glad to get my 10% off at the big box home improvement store, like that's not really what I need from the civilian world. I need the civilian world to be just aware that we're fighting in a war in Afghanistan 5 years ago when I was deployed there. Just to want to sit down and have a conversation about the sacrifices that military members go through. And instead, we've got this, no, just thank you for what you're doing. And there's some sense there that's like, I'm not even sure what you're thanking me for. Like, do you have any idea what is being asked of the people that live next door to me? And so there is this reverse kind of setup that's happened post-Vietnam. Anyway, that's an aside. That one's free. All right, loss of hope, extended isolation, feelings of abandonment, repulsion to death. We talked last night at dinner about remains collection and how that can change your entire outlook on the world and the way that it exists. And of course, broken relationships, which probably should just be on the lookout for every single domain. All right. This is a conceptual item I've been working on for a few years and trying to improve and get a better understanding of how we see and how we understand moral injury and PTSD. And it's very flat on a piece of paper here because this is the way our minds tend to work. We tend to work in very two-dimensional spaces. And so what we assume is that wherever the bang is, wherever the catastrophe or trauma or whatever happened, that there is a blast zone that exists beyond that, right? And so we think that POWs and hand-to-hand combat, that those people are in some sort of blast zone where we expect them in some ways to be fairly broken when they return from those kind of situations. And then our ground soft and infantry and snipers and our generalized people that are forces in contact, those people that we think of being out on the battlefield as warriors, we expect those folks to return back in some sort of broken fashion. And in our idealized mind, that makes a lot of sense. And so in my experience, I have seen folks in this area have some PTSD stuff and really struggle with some items. But I tend to see less moral injury here. And the reason is because I think there's a protective factor that's associated with those particular jobs. If you know that it's your job to go to combat to kill people for a living, you've probably spent at least a little bit of time thinking about what it means to kill people for a living. Okay, so there's that expectation that those guys can be broken. I was at this seminar down at SOS at Maxwell for my fellow captains. We had this wonderful POW who was speaking to us and telling us his story. It was inspiring and amazing. And one of my fellow students thought he was quite clever and got up to the mic and asked a question that was, "Hey, sir, you've really been through it. You've really had some hard things happen to you in life. What do you think about these people that have never even been to the battlefield that come back and say they're all messed up?" And I love the answer that the POW gave. Because obviously, right, he's like trying to roll him right into the answer he wants to hear. But the POW guy, he goes, "Hey man, listen, I only had to return home once, and that was hard enough. I can't imagine having to do that 5 or 6 times." And just shut it down, right? He just shut down that whole line of thinking. And so part of what I want to do today is look at how this moral injury thing exists outside of this blast zone. So then we move to outside the wire here is kind of our next layer. We've got our direct support troops, and we got FOB personnel, and we got combat zone air crew. And these are people who are not necessarily always in the fight, but they're returning back and forth from the fight to safety on a regular basis. But then maybe something happens where it gets a little more kinetic than they expected. So for instance, you've got your FOB personnel who one day the base is overrun, and even though they had this relative sense of safety, now all of a sudden they're in it, and something has really happened. And they weren't really processing that this morning. Or this combat zone air crew who has trained over and over and over again to go drop ordnance on an X when they're out here on the range somewhere, but then all of a sudden the X is not just an imaginary target, it is a human being, and they have to think about the consequences of their action and that what that means in terms of their belief system, and they have to process. So there's this weird intermediate area where people are going in and out of the zone. Or what about other aircrew, right? So this guy who you've got someone who is refueling planes, and then all of a sudden one day he sits around and actually thinks about, what do those planes go to do? And maybe he pops up CNN and reads through some articles or something, and now he's like, crap, I enable all that. Am I okay with that? I thought I was just making fuel go from big tank to little tank. But now, in reality, I'm a part of an overall war system, and I now have to wrestle with the right and wrong of not only my actions, but all the actions that now happen because I was part of that. One thing that's really interesting here, we've got our nice little barbed wire at a combat base. You know, we've got the T-walls, we've got everything that seems like we're protected. And then one day that gets shattered for one reason or another because an IDF comes over and it gets really, really close. And we remember that we're at war. All right, so a couple more layers out here, right? Now all of a sudden we're at home station and we've got command teams who are making decisions about who's here and here. We've got support functions that are getting people on a plane to get them over to those locations. Our RPA operators is just a weird setup. We'll go through that in a minute. Our intel troops, and then of course, they touch the lives of spouses and families and communities. So this is how our mind likes to think about PTSD and moral injury. This is what we think, how we think the world exists. However, we believe that there's an increased sense of safety as we move farther and farther away from the bang. And I don't have a great way to do this in PowerPoint yet, so you're going to have to bear with me. But what if the bang wraps all the way around to where now it's in our community? I think that's what happened on 9/11. We had this increased sense of safety because we lived in the greatest nation on earth. And that kind of stuff happens over there, not here. But now all of a sudden, one day we wake up and the bang is in our backyard. It's in downtown New York City. And how do we deal with that? And how do we think about that? And oh, by the way, not only is it in New York City, but it's on all of our television screens. And so now, if we go back a couple slides to those who witnessed it, do we have some sense of moral injury about what we have seen happen to people that we identify with? Increased sense of safety. I think moral injury, like if you've ever seen someone explain a black hole, they'll like fold up the piece of paper and they'll like stick something through it. We think everything exists in this real linear world and time frame. But moral injury, in my opinion, violates all this stuff on a regular basis. We also feel an increased power differential, right? So if the bang happens all the way up here, and I am here, I am at this safely protected combat base, I feel like I'm at a joint operations center. We are doing the war to those people. But the war is not really here. We're controlling the war. We have this power differential that says, no, we're orchestrating how things go down. Okay, so back in Bagram in 2016, I'm sitting at the base, and I don't know how to express this one on paper either, but something like this happens, where all of a sudden, rather than us being safe at that base, we had a suicide bomber that was there on the base with us. And he blew himself up, and he took some of our troops along with him. And we found out one of the folks that was his brother worked at the DFAC right there that served us every day for 3 meals a day. And so here we thought we were doing the war to other people, and this guy was collecting intel on us. The war was being done to us, and this power differential just collapsed in a heartbeat. Another thing we think happens in this real linear system is that there's one of our RPA lieutenant colonels, he talks about the intimacy that exists in warfare. And so we assume that the farther that we get away from the bang, his name is Colonel David Blair. He wrote an article called Avengers in Wrath. I would highly recommend you read it. His thesis is that moral injury is a TTP, a tactic, a technique, and a procedure of the enemy. That this is something that they use to break us, to make us incapable warriors. They will do this stuff on purpose because they understand that we're going to have to wrestle with these things. And if you can't cause casualties, medical casualties, you start looking for other ways to cause casualties. And so he worked with a bunch of RPA folks, and he would say, like, people will take their kids all kinds of places just because they know that we're less likely to target them at that moment in time. They're doing that on purpose. That is not a mistake. That is a tactic, technique, and procedure of the enemy. Okay, so as we think about this reduced intimacy, when we think about POWs and hand-to-hand folks, we are thinking about how they know what that other person smells like, how they know what their captor does on a daily basis. They know their schedule. They hear about their families. They have this intimacy that exists. And somehow in this weird world of modern combat, we have taken that bang and we have moved that all the way back here to home station to our RPA operators, where they now have this increased sense of intimacy about who this person is. When do they go to the mosque? What time do they get up in the morning? Where do they go for groceries? Where do they take their kids? All of these different things that you wouldn't know if you're just dropping ordnance from somewhere over here. Now all of a sudden you have all these intimate details about this other person's life, and it humanizes them. And listen, we want warriors who understand how to humanize other people, because we need them making ethical decisions. It does not make you immoral, or it does not make you a bad airman that you have morals. We need that. But when that gets used against you, so that what you're trying to do is do something that is in the stream of what is just and right, but now all of a sudden there are these complicating factors, and now the bang has come home because you thought you had this reduced intimacy, but now you are desperately familiar with the people on the ground who might be the target. All right. One more. Reduced proximity. So another idea we have here is that the farther away we get from the bang, that the war is a thing that exists over there and not here. And what I mean by reduced proximity here really comes to care providers, it comes to spouses, it comes to people who are in the orbit of people who go to war. And especially in a community where war is something that could just be any given Thursday. It's not back in the way we used to think about it, where you go do your year and you come home and that's it, that's the end of war. Instead, now all of a sudden, the war comes home on a regular basis. We've got I love the idea that I can call my wife from overseas. I hate the idea that I can call my wife from overseas, because somehow we start to talk about something that's important that's happening there. And that is really just, I'm not sure how helpful that is for her. But the alternative is, if we don't talk about that, I tell her that it's Taco Tuesday again, even though she knows it's Taco Tuesday, because it's always Taco Tuesday every Tuesday, right? Or we start talking about things that are incredibly unimportant. And so where maybe it used to be that I would sit down and compose a nice letter that would actually express some things that were important in a short and verify form that I could take some time to think over and over again. Now we just pop on to a Skype call at the end of every day, or the beginning of every day, or whatever, however the time zones work out. And now we are sharing intimate details of our lives, again collapsing that proximity of warfare to the home front. What did the study in the ISR community, they talked about combat to cul-de-sac, right? And so that idea that you go to the AOR every day and then you come home and coach soccer. Like, how weird is that? That is not the way our brains want to think about this model. And so what I see happening is a lot of gatekeeping that goes, okay, these dudes, we get it, they're screwed up. That makes sense. Okay, we're good with that. But if you're any of these folks out here, not only do you not intrinsically understand that there might be something about combat that's bothering you, but also a lot of times when you tell somebody else that there's something about combat that's bothering you, you were told that's not a valid feeling because you weren't there. You were out here. Does that make sense? Anybody have questions on this model?
Yeah,
All right, so here's your assignment. If you got your pen and paper out, I'm going to show you a video clip. And one of the things that we're attempting to answer is a lot of this research that has been done around moral injury seems to happen in the space of warfare and combat. And so there's a real interesting question there about why do we see this moral injuries thing so often in those spaces? So I'm going to show you a clip. Go ahead and hit the next button there. Okay, so it used to be in a room, I would begin to show a clip like this, and everyone in the room would have base ground knowledge of exactly who this was and what we were about to talk about and where the clip was coming from. However, especially as I began to work with younger and younger airmen, I realized that may be a bad assumption. So someone who is a Star Wars nerd, if you can give us a 1-minute synopsis of the overall Star Wars world. What is Star Wars about? Who's that Star Wars nerd that has this for me? Oh my gosh. Give us to us. 1 minute. What is this epic story about? I know I'm putting you on the spot.
I don't know. What are you looking for?
Well, somebody help her out.
Morality?
It's a morality tale for sure, right? What else? It's the struggle of, in particular, one character. Who? It's Luke, right? That's who that's who centers around it. And he has all these things happen to him where there is this dark and this light side, this good and this evil that seem to be having to continue to come in and out of balance, right? Okay, so it's your morality tale of Star Wars. Okay, who's this guy? Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? And what we're going to watch is when he meets Luke, and some great videographer on YouTube stitched in a whole bunch of flashback scenes. It's fantastic. But what you are going to do is basically get an entire epic story in about 7 minutes. And what I want you to look for as you see it is this is all based around a warfare combat type situations. I want you to look for morally injurious events that you see and just jot some of those down as we go along, okay? All right, so that's your mission. Here we go. So now you got all the Star Wars backstory there. Isn't it cool how they splice together all of those different events, right? And so if you know anything about Alec Guinness as an actor, he I think he does such an incredible job. And again, you don't realize it when you're watching it the first time through, though. But as somebody breaks apart that clip and you kind of see the expressions on his face. So Alec Guinness, the actor who played Obi-Wan, he's a Royal Navy officer during World War II. He was involved in the landing of Sicily. And the Allies lost 24,000 men in that 38-day campaign. And I tell you, I feel something of that in his performance throughout those, and of course you got to remember that was made before any of the rest of that was made, right? So this is early in the way that these things were produced, and so he brings some of that character to this performance. This is a guy who actually understood what warfare meant, and probably had seen betrayal at some point in his life and seen atrocities happen. Okay, so what were the things that, as you watched through, what were some of the things that jumped out to you that made you go, yeah, that's something that happens on a battlefield that probably produces moral injury? Who's got one? Yes? A friend becomes an enemy. Okay? So you talked to Arjuna earlier, right? He's driving up and down and he sees friends on both sides of the conflict. What else? Yeah. Yeah, the loss of a comrade. Yep. What else? Yeah.
At least from how they spliced the clips together, kind of took on a responsibility for all the deaths that his pupil caused.
Yeah, right? So he is now, there's this moral transference that happens because his actions even though he thought they were good and right in the moment, led to something that turned out to be evil. And did he enable that? That would be something that he'd have to think through, right? What else? Yes.
You made a comment about being the guardians of peace and justice, but then as you watch the clips, they're not really guardians. They're fighting each other around peace and justice, which
Yeah.
to me is a whole dichotomy of how do you say we're going for peace and
Right. So how does violence work into that? The phrase was guardians of peace and justice. So how do you square the violence that needs to be done in order to maintain peace and justice? Where is the line? Where is the right and wrong and all of that stuff? That is a question that people have to ask once they enter the battlefield. What else? You guys are so polite and kind. Most of the people I work with just shout out answers. So go for it. What have you got? Right, so his mentor dies, right? So someone who he trusted dies, and how do we process that? Because your identity is built around that person that has guided you throughout the path, and at some point now you have to blaze your own path alone. And how does that work? What else?
Isolation causing your mind to ramble with so many thoughts.
Yeah. Okay. So he said isolation causing the mind to ramble with so many thoughts. So this kid who knows nothing is now asking him questions. And what's he doing in his mind? He's piecing together a narrative that is acceptable for the audience involved. Do any of you finding yourself piecing together a narrative that is acceptable for the audience involved? Right? Because I don't want to take this home to my wife and kids. I definitely don't feel like this is a conversation I can have with some dude who sits next to me in an airport, right? This is the conversations of things that happen in warfare are something that seems to be contained within a community, and to break those boundaries outside of the community, we reframe those narratives into something that we think will be morally acceptable to them. There's a great story, I think it's in the Afterwar book, Nancy Sherman's book, where she talks about this guy who goes and does his years, and then he gets the GI Bill, goes out into college, and they're having discussions about warfare at college in this place where he is the only one that's ever seen anything regarding warfare. And in that circumstance, it's very easy for every one of them to say it's never justifiable to kill another human being, right? But this guy has done that, and where's the nuance? How do you have nuanced conversations with people who have no frame of context for what you do for a living? What else? Any other things that we should pick up there? Yeah, Tom.
Yeah, just kind of piggybacking on that because I'm a Star Wars nerd. Later on, Luke asks Ben, "You told me that Vader killed my father," and Ben comes back and says, "What I told you was true from a certain point of view."
From a certain point of view, right? Yeah, we do this stuff all the time. We are creating narratives, and in some ways, right, back to, I'm sorry, I don't remember whose comment it was, but said something about, I think it might have been yours, Senior, that he has enabled these things to happen through his action. He trained this guy, and so in some ways, maybe he's rewriting the story for himself, too. Okay, it wasn't my student who did that. It was Vader, this other character who had been overtaken. And had he not been overtaken by these evil, corruptive influences, my student would have never done that. What else? Yeah.
I think the last thing I really noticed was just kind of a concept of survivor's guilt. Because you saw all these Jedis, they're getting killed. And he mentioned in the very beginning, is like, I am one of the last ones left. Or there used to be many, and now they're almost all extinct. Which, of course, then made me think of Elijah and everyone else is all gone, and I'm the only one left.
The only one left, right? So this moral, if the moral truism that you started with was that the world is basically a good place, and good overrules evil if given enough time and effort by good people. And here he's invested, and now we're in the dark times, right? And so the world is not making sense at this moment, and he's the only one left fighting. And that's, so now, boy, isn't it weird that he's like isolated out there all alone on a planet by himself? We don't know any veterans that do that, do we? Right, I got a buddy, fought in Fallujah, a Marine, and he posted on social media once that he had just bought a ranch out in Montana, and that anyone was welcome to that ranch if they were a veteran, and anyone else should stay away. And having known him for many years, he meant that in a very threatening manner. And so literally that I'm going out to be alone. And the only people that I will accept into this circle are people who understand. Okay, any other thoughts on this clip? If you want to find this clip, it's called Obi-Wan Has PTSD. I have hijacked it because I believe Obi-Wan had a lot of moral injury in addition to his PTSD. But if you want to find it on YouTube, I think it's a great resource just to get a conversation starter. It creates a little bit of distance where we can talk about a thing that didn't really exist and then connect it to something that does really exist. And I find that that's an effective tool, and I think that's something you'll probably get into as well. In one of the ways that we do this is we don't necessarily come at these things straight ahead. You kind of have to roll around the edges a little bit, and discovery will happen. Okay. Rita Nakashima Brock says, what is significant about combat exposure is that it raises stakes and generates extreme situations so reliably. So as I'm thinking about why combat over and over and over again, and I would especially as warfare changes and as combat changes and we bring it more to remote connected effects, I would say the reason that we see moral injury so much in the force in general is because of a few things. So loss of comrades, which is one that was mentioned, right? And then we get these questions, we start to get these heady moral questions, like why would God allow my friend to die? We get questions of why do we even need to be in this war in the first place? We get questions of, oh my gosh, especially after the things that have happened in Afghanistan over the last few weeks, was any of this worth it? H.L. Mencken has a quote that says there's, and I'm not going to exactly get this right, but basically he says, for any difficult question, there is an answer that is simple, neat, and wrong. And so all of us have a lot of simple, neat answers for those questions. You know, whether that comes from theology, whether that comes from our outlook as people who believe that there is such a thing as a just warfare, or who may even be involved in a military system at all. All of you have somewhat wrestled with the idea of war because you're all sitting here. We have all of these answers that work, but often they are simple, neat, and because we are not an expert on that person's moral injury, a lot of times they are wrong. But we offer those answers attempting to make them feel better and assuage maybe their guilt, to assuage their feelings of wrestling with items that are difficult, because we don't like seeing people in pain. And so we just want to relieve that for them. But I would tell you, in this field of moral injury, relieving that pain is not exactly what we're going for in a quick and easy way. We are looking to sit with them in it, and to let them develop narratives and let them understand how to close that distance between the way things are and the way things should be. And if you give them a quick, simple, black and white answer that maybe works for you, I will just tell you, it may not work for them. Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. But I just want to caution us to make sure that we are living and we are enduring in the complexity of moral thought, and not just tossing a Bible verse at them that makes us feel better when we're sad. Hope that makes sense. All right, so loss of comrades. And survivor's guilt is this weird thing. The human mind will do all sorts of pretzel-like things in order to make sure that it can somehow take responsibility for the loss of a comrade. Well, 12 weeks ago, we decided to go to lunch at this time, and so that pushed those guys' mission forward, and so then they had to take that, and then that put us on a different rotation, and now 12 weeks later, my buddy got injured, and that should have been me instead of him. And your mind will work all those pieces in order for you to figure out how you somehow can be culpable, and I think what's really going on is that in some ways I think we would, for the moral complexity reason, it would just be easier to deal with this if it was us. That would be easier for us to process, is that, okay, I am the one who should be dead right now. And then I really wouldn't have to think about it. But it says my buddy who I've lost. And now my brain wants to figure out how somehow I'm responsible for that stuff. Another thing that I think combat produces that's extremely reliably recreates as morally injurious circumstances is the viewing of atrocities. When you go to combat, you see things that other people will never see or never be a part of. In fact, when we were at Herbie, because our folks were deploying so frequently, one of our objectives was to make sure that within 1 hour of them hitting the ground, they were to their families. Because for a lot of those guys, this was something, deployment was not like a once-in-a-lifetime event. It was like any Thursday in October every year. You know, it's just part of who they were and where they existed. And so our commander said, okay, in 1 hour after they hit the ground, we are getting those people back home to their families so they can spend max amount of time. And so this guy had 5 minutes with our returning folks to give them some words of wisdom that I hope would set them on a good path to where they were going. And what I would do is I would tell this story. I'm saying, hey, listen, guys, tomorrow you're going to be at Starbucks, and the person in front of you is going to get the wrong amount of whipped cream in their soy latte. And they are going to lose their ever-loving mind. And I need you to do me a favor. Please don't kill them. Right? And they laugh at that, right? Because they've been on deployment for 4 months where we're thinking about life and death on a regular basis, and we're wrestling with complex moral circumstances all the time. And then what's going to happen is you come back to the civilian world that doesn't know what you know and hasn't seen what you have seen. And you try to take that framework and bring it back home. And the tendency is for you to put your finger in that guy's face and tell him he has no clue what the real world is like, and to give him a taste of his own medicine as he's abusing somebody behind the counter, right? And what I have to reframe for them is this idea that the reason that most of us raised our hand to sign up for this job in the first place was so that that guy could stay home. And literally, that could be a big problem in his life. Like literally, that is the most difficult thing this guy will probably face this day or this week. And that's why we go do what we do. So don't lose sight of that the reason you went is for that to be the large problems in the world instead of the things that you've had to face and deal with. And so that helped to reframe the way they felt about how everybody thought about their service, some of the conversation we had during the break, right? Help for them to reframe how everybody thought about their service versus what they actually were providing to give that guy that opportunity and to give their kids an opportunity to live in a place where they didn't have to think about warfare on a regular basis. All right, so here's the things that I think happen in combat. Taking of life, the loss of comrades, and the viewing of atrocities. Those things are we see them over and over in combat, and I think that that's why this moral injury thing tends to keep appearing in the literature around combat. Okay, so I want to just pause here for a few minutes. This concludes kind of what this was our 30,000-foot view of moral injury. What we were looking to do here is just get some terms down, get an understanding of what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the day, and then we're going to move into some more specific stuff about counseling and potential interventions. But I just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page in terms of what moral injury, at least definition-wise, what it is for the sake of this conference. It's incredibly complex. But for the sake of this conference, what we're thinking about, what we're looking at. So any overview questions that we should that anybody has any questions about that we can dive into here to make sure that we're all on the same page? I didn't do that good, I promise you.
Amazing.
Okay. Does this help?
Absolutely.
Does this help frame? Okay. A lot of times, the first time people are exposed to this in a more detailed way, they do start to, I've got the stack of literature here, right? They start to go, oh, that thing that I couldn't help that guy figure out how to get unstuck. I wonder if it's some of this. The first time they hear this, a lot of times they'll go back and all of a sudden, it's like the first, when you buy a red Honda CR-V, all of a sudden you notice everybody in the world drives a red Honda CR-V. and literally it's the exact same number of red Honda CRVs that were on the road yesterday, but now all of a sudden, because it has entered your atmosphere, you're on the lookout for it. And that's literally what I've hoped to do for you today, is to enter this into your atmosphere so that when you see it, you go, I got this. I know what we're looking at here.